and that soon after Joseph becoming a Mason, he introduced the Temple Endowment. There are some similarities the Church acknowledges between the Masonic ceremonies and the endowment, but there's also some stark differences in their content and intent. It says it's a myth that the endowment ceremony has its origins from Solomon's Temple, or that Masonry passed down parts of the endowment over the century from Solomon's Temple. Solomon's Temple was all about animal sacrifice. Freemasonry has its origins to stone tradesmen in medieval Europe.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So we're continuing the series looking at temples and the connections to Freemasonry, and also connections to some ancient temple rites in future episodes, and changes made to temple ordinances over time. In the first episode, it was sort of an introduction into Latter-day Saints' view of the theology of temples, some of the ordinances that we do in there, and sort of outlining what are going to be the episodes that we're going to cover in this series. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at Freemasonry, the criticism and the claim that Joseph Smith borrowed or plagiarized elements from Freemasonry, that Joseph was a Freemason, and that 6 weeks later he brought out the Temple Endowment that has a lot of similarities and connections to a Masonic ceremony, kind of undermining and calling into question the inspiration of the Temple Endowment as well. So we're going to be looking at what is Freemasonry, when did it originate, how and when did Joseph Smith become a Freemason, and some of the parallels and the connections and the things which are pretty identical between a Masonic ceremony and the Temple Endowment. Actually, a lot of this will come from the church's website. They do have an essay on Masonry and the Temple Endowment. And part one will be focusing primarily on the similarities between the endowment ceremony and a Masonic ceremony. And part two will then be addressing more of some of the apologetic reconciliations given by different faithful scholars on this topic. So this will be mostly focusing on what critics have to say and the connections. So I'm going to be doing a separate episode really focusing on the apologetics because I don't want this to be too long. So what is Freemasonry? So Freemasonry is a fraternal organization that grew out of centuries-old European trade guilds. Freemasons, or Masons, meet in lodges where they ritually reenact a story based on the brief biblical account of a man named Hiram, whom Solomon commissioned to work on the temple in Jerusalem. During the reenactment, Masons advance by degrees using hand grips, keywords, and special clothing. In Masonic rituals, Masons commit to be worthy of trust and to be loyal to their Masonic brothers. In addition to participating in these rituals, Masons meet socially, participate in community building activities, and make charitable contributions to various causes. So some early Latter-day Saints were also Freemasons, including Hiram Smith, Heber C. Kimball, and others who belonged to Masonic lodges in the 1820s, and Joseph Smith joined the fraternity in March of 1842. In Nauvoo, Illinois, and that soon after Joseph becoming a Mason, he introduced the Temple Endowment. There are some similarities the Church acknowledges between the Masonic ceremonies and the endowment, but there's also some stark differences in their content and intent. And that's what we'll be focusing more on in the next episode, is the difference between the ritual of the endowment, the presentation of the endowment, and the endowment itself, and the covenants and the doctrine. But there are definitely, in the ritual elements, a lot of striking similarities. Latter-day Saints Q&A says it was a very controversial group. It still is because of the secrecy. In fact, Joseph Smith said that the secret of Masonry is to keep a secret there. But that was part of their practice, to show fidelity to the covenants, essentially. Also, there is concern that they replaced religion without salvation. To be a Mason, it just required belief in God, but there is no focus on Christ, nor any kind of focus on salvation. And it's a focus on ritual drama of teaching through active participation, focused on a man named Hiram Abiff. Whereas the Temple Endowment is very much focused on Jesus Christ and the creation and Garden of Eden, and co-participating as like Adam and Eve as an archetype in our journey back to God. So when did Freemasonry originate? The church says there are no known Masonic documents before about 1400. This is AD or CE. The earliest record tells the story of Masonry originating during Old Testament times. The oldest surviving minutes of Masonic lodges date to about 1600 and indicate that the organization was primarily concerned with regulating the trade of stone masonry. They say that the rituals of Freemasonry appear to have originated in early modern Europe. However, aspects of these ceremonies bear resemblance to religious rites in many cultures, ancient and modern. Okay, so we're talking about masonry, stone masonry originating 14th to 15th century CE in medieval Europe. I'll be talking about this in future episodes, that there are some similarities, particularly with some of the gestures and the hand grips, the signs and the tokens, and either some of the clothing, to what we might see in ancient cultures and ancient rituals, which we'll be looking at in a future episode. So let's talk a little about masonry in Nauvoo. So in December 1841, 18 Mormon Masons organized a lodge in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith and 40 others applied for membership the following day, on the 15th of March 1842. Joseph and Sidney Rigdon advanced to the degree of entered apprentice in the upper floor space above Joseph's red brick store. The next day, Jonas passed Joseph and Sidney as fellow craft and raised them as master masons. On May 3rd, 1842, so this is around 6 weeks later, Joseph enlisted a few men to prepare the space in his red brick store in which the Nauvoo Masons met, preparatory to giving endowments to a few elders. The next day, Joseph introduced the Temple Endowment for the first time to 9 men, all of whom were also Masons. So this is when the endowment was first initiated, was 6 weeks after Joseph Smith advanced to becoming a master mason. And he gave the endowment to some of these men who were already Masons. Now, when the Kirtland Temple, when it was first dedicated, they spoke about them receiving an endowment, and washings and anointings were performed at the Kirtland Temple, but the endowment as we practice today after the washing and anointing wasn't restored or introduced until May 1842. So March 15th, 1842, we have Joseph and Sidney advancing to Master Mason, and then 6 weeks later, Joseph in the red brick store introducing the Temple Endowment to a few of his followers. Mormon Think has to say, there is no doubt that Joseph Smith knew the Masonic rituals before he introduced the Temple ceremony. Joseph was initiated as an apprentice Mason on March 15th, 1842, and received the fellow craft and master degrees the following day. He introduced the full endowment ceremony, which included the secret signs, tokens, passwords, and penalties, just 7 weeks later on May 4th, 1842. And many of the ritual aspects of the endowment, it's undisputed that this was influenced and borrowed from Masonry, that it was certainly a catalyst in Joseph implementing and introducing the Temple Endowment, particularly in the signs, the tokens, the passwords, the hand grips, some of the ritualistic language and clothing worn, is extremely and undeniably similar to a Masonic ceremony. So Mormon Think highlights some of the similarities between the Masonic ceremony that Joseph would have been introduced to 6 weeks prior and the Temple Endowment. That both in the Temple Endowment and Masonic ceremony there is a preparation room, the symbols of the compass and the square. The compass is pressed against the left breast and the square the right breast, identical to the marks on the temple garment. There is also a washing ceremony anointing the head, eyes, mouth, ears, similar to the washing and anointing ritual, and the reception of a new name. However, I would like to say that Joseph introduced the washing and anointing ritual at the Kirtland Temple in 1836, so he didn't borrow this from Freemasonry, but you could argue that he could have taken that from, Exodus in the Old Testament, when Aaron and his priests are going through this priestly initiation where they're washed and anointed and given garments. I have a slide about the hand grips and handshakes in Masonry. I don't want to show the ones in the Temple Endowment. I'm a bit sensitive about this, but this is just to try to be transparent and show the similarities. LDS Discussion says, beyond the grips, here's the text of the Masonic ceremony as the member is given the signs and tokens of each grip. Worshipful Master, pass, what is that? Senior Deacon, the pass grip of a fellow craft. Has it a name? It has. Will you give it to me? I did not so receive it, neither will I so impart it. And the words exchanged here, this is very similar to what happens in the Temple Endowment. Another connection between the Masonic ritual and the Temple Endowment is the 5 points of fellowship. The Masonic ceremony included what is known as the 5 points of fellowship, which is where the worshipful master and the senior deacon place their bodies in a way that align foot to foot knee to knee, breast to breast, hand to back, cheek to cheek, or mouth to ear. This is a very close and intimate alignment that would never be allowed at a church dance. That's kind of funny because it makes you think of a church dance. You had to be like Book of Mormon apart. So they're saying that this was very close and intimate. But this was used and was part of the temple ceremony until it was removed in 1990. Likely because it is extremely uncomfortable for women to place their breasts against those of the male temple workers. And this is another area that is now removed that Joseph Smith had originally taken directly from the Masonic ceremony. And we'll definitely address, I think, in a separate episode, all the changes that have been made to the Temple Endowment over time. This certainly being one, the 5 points of fellowship. It wasn't part of the Temple Endowment whenever I went through. And I can see why this seemed disturbing to people as they were going through the Temple Endowment. But then begging the question of, why is this Masonic element? Why was it part of the Temple Endowment in the first place? And then why was it removed in 1990? There are also penalties in the endowment, which were given by symbolically slitting one's throats and bowels, saying that they'd rather take their life than disclose the covenants which were made. This is another element which is near identical to Masonry, which made its way into the endowment ceremony, and similarly to the 5 points of fellowship, was removed in 1990. There are also similarities between temple clothing and a Masonic ceremony, the wearing of robes, a hat, aprons, etc. And a lot of those clothing was worn by priests who were initiated in the Old Testament. I talked about that with Jasmine Rapley. So you could say that maybe Masons were influenced by those parts in the Bible, but that sort of clothing being worn isn't just exclusive to a Masonic ceremony. So there are undeniable similarities in the ritualistic elements of the Temple Endowment between that and Freemasonry. Critics acknowledge that, the church acknowledges that as well. And many of the early members and early followers in the church believed that the Temple Endowment, that this was a restoration of ancient temple rites, and that Masonry was sort of this degenerated, apostatized form. It was almost this corrupted form of the endowment that Joseph Smith was restoring, taking the parts of Masonry that went back to ancient times. LDS Discussions writes, Masons immediately noticed how similar they were to the point that they considered the Masonic ceremony of divine origin that was restored back to its divine origins by Joseph Smith. Some of the quotes by Heber C. Kimball, he says, we have the true Masonry. The Masonry of today is received from the apostasy which took place in the days of Solomon and David. They have now and then a thing that is correct, but we have the real thing. He also wrote that Brother Joseph says that Masonry was taken from the priesthood, but has become degenerated. Joseph Fielding says, many have joined the Masonic institution. This seems to have been a stepping stone or preparation for something else, the true origin of Masonry. President Franklin D. Richards wrote in 1890, certain mystic rites which are practiced throughout Christendom claim antiquity with Solomon's Temple. Benjamin F. Johnston says that he, Joseph Smith, told me Freemasonry as at present was the apostate endowment, as sectarian religion was the apostate religion. And President Franklin D. Richards said again that Joseph the Prophet was aware that there were some things about Masonry which had come down from the beginning, and he desired to know what they were, hence the lodge. The Masons admitted some keys of knowledge appertaining to Masonry were lost. Joseph inquired of the Lord concerning the matter, and he revealed to the prophet true Masonry, as we have it in our temples. Owing to the superior knowledge Joseph had received, the Masons became jealous and cut off the Mormon lodge. So it seems like Joseph believed and was telling the early members that Freemasonry, that this was some sort of corrupted, degenerated form of the original endowment, and that Joseph Smith was restoring it as well, taking those parts which are true or correct and restoring it, and sort of combining Joseph's doctrinal and theological innovations and perhaps revelations that he had received prior. But these quotes, I think, do clearly show that they believe that the temple endowment was ancient, that it originated from Solomon's temple. And LDS Discussions has to say that what the church does not tell you is that the Masonic ceremony did not begin until medieval Europe. That seems to be when scholars say they can first date these Masonic lodges originating. And that Solomon's temple was about animal sacrifice and had nothing to do with the Masons or the church's endowment ceremony. The CS letter similarly argues regarding the temple and Masonic rituals that Freemasonry has zero links to Solomon's temple. although more church folklore with origins from comments made by early Masons, such as Heber C. Kimball, says it's a myth that the endowment ceremony has its origins from Solomon's Temple, or that Masonry passed down parts of the endowment over the century from Solomon's Temple. Solomon's Temple was all about animal sacrifice. Freemasonry has its origins to stone tradesmen in medieval Europe. And he quotes Farrer, who even acknowledged, unfortunately, there is no historical evidence to support a continuous functioning line from Solomon's Temple to the present. We know what went on in Solomon's Temple. It's the ritualistic slaughter of animals. And that while Masonry, while claiming a root in antiquity, can only be reliably traced to medieval stone tradesmen. And that it is clear that Freemasonry and its traditions played a role in the development of the endowment ritual. And even he goes on to say, if there's no connection to Solomon's Temple, then what's so divine about a man-made medieval European secret fraternity and its rituals? And I think this is a really valid question if the claim is that he is restoring an ancient temple ritual and that this goes back to Solomon's Temple. But if Freemasonry originated in the 14th, 15th century, then is there anything divine about this? There's two different apologetics which we will explore in the next episode. But the claim or the belief that these rituals go back to Solomon's Temple is even acknowledged by Greg Kearney when he is asked, wouldn't it be more correct to say that Masonry came out of the endowment? He says it would be if you believe that Freemasonry has a continuous historical line from Solomon's Temple to the current. Unfortunately, there is no historical evidence to support a continuous functioning line from Solomon's Temple to the present. We know what went on in Solomon's Temple, the ritualistic slaughter of animals. Now, but what we will be exploring in future episodes is some of the connections between the ritual of the temple endowment and Masonry to ancient rituals practiced, for example, in ancient Egypt and other cultures, and also some early Christians as well, because there are some striking similarities. I want to finish with what the critics have to say about Freemasonry and the connections to the rituals. And then the next episode, we will really be exploring more about the apologetics. Beyond some of the ritualistic aspects, also there's a lot of connections in symbols and symbolism between Freemasonry and the temple. Beyond the similarities in the use of clothing, handshakes, penalties, washings, signs, tokens, and structure, there are also many symbols that are used both in Masonry and the LDS temples. Both the Masonic Lodge and LDS temples use the same symbols, such as the beehive, all-seeing eye, square and compass, 5 points of fellowship, although that was really a ritual element. Use of the phrase holiness to the Lord, although that was also in the Old Testament as well. Sun, moon, and stars. A critical conclusion on Masonry and the connection to the temple endowment, this would be, I think, the critics' position, what they would claim. While the church wants to call all of these just parallels, I don't know how else to make it clear that Joseph Smith created the endowment ceremony from the Masonic ceremony and then taught that the Masons had the original endowment. As we mentioned above, Joseph Smith created this endowment right as he was introducing polygamy to other members, which required extreme secrecy and penalties for talking about it outside of the temple. This is also why members have to wear garments featuring the symbols of the temple, which, as we mentioned above, were identical to how the Masons used these same symbols. What will be quite interesting is we'll be looking at some ancient cultures and ancient writings and art that also depict monks and other ancient people having some of these similar marks as well on clothing. In other words, every day when you put on garments, you're wearing Masonic symbols. I know the apologetic response is that the purposes were different, and that's true in the sense that Masons were not being endowed with power before being sealed in secret marriages. But if you look above between Joseph Smith taking the Masonic rituals and then teaching the members that they had the original endowment that fell into apostasy, it makes a lot more sense than claiming they are merely parallels with no connection in origin, purpose, or divinity. And I think the church and believers and apologists who are informed, it is undeniable that Joseph Smith believed and taught and took from Freemasonry to create the temple endowment. The question is there any antiquity? Is there any correspondences between the temple endowment and what we see with ancient rituals? Because if that's the case, then Masonry was certainly a catalyst and an influence, or either Joseph just borrowed it and mixed it with his own doctrinal innovations and ideas. The brief summary of what the critics say about the Temple Endowment, and I got this from LDS Truth Claims, who I will be doing an interview with, is Brett McDonald. He has a couple of really great episodes on temples and Masonry. And very simply, Masons used to think that they are an ancient tradition, going back to Solomon's Temple. But now we know that they are modern and that their rituals were made up around the 14th or 15th century. But Joseph Smith did not realize that the Masons were modern and that their rituals were made up, assuming that they went back to ancient times. Therefore, arguing that Joseph Smith was not a prophet. And in part 2, we will be exploring the apologetic responses, looking at what people like Matthew Brown, Stephen Harper, Jeff Bradshaw, Scott Gordon, and others have to say on this topic as well. Way too much to squeeze in to this video. But it's important to be aware of these similarities and these connections. I would encourage you to read through the church's essay on it, and also read what the critics have to say as well. And in future episodes, I'm very excited to be looking at the connections to ancient rites and rituals. Examining the claim is that, could the Temple Endowment possibly be a restoration of ancient temple rites? Thanks so much for watching. Take care.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website, and you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.